What's up, everybody? It's Spencer Alessi, and this is the Esports Narrative. All right, thank you for joining me on another episode of the Esports Narrative, a podcast about the exploration of competitive video gaming and the passionate communities that make it so exciting. Super awesome to have you here again. My name is Spencer Alessi. I am your host, and joining me this time is Tyler Schrodt. He is the founder and CEO of the official EGF, the Electronic Gaming Federation. Super awesome dude. He's got a stunning beard. We talk about that in the show. We also talk about where the money comes from for the EGF. We talk about the size of the EGF. How many schools does EGF have under its brand? We talk about the staff, what that looks like for them. We talk about, should collegiate esports athletes be allowed to make money? We talk about some of the pitfalls of the NCAA and how to not become the NCAA and a lot of other fun stuff. I know you guys are going to really like this episode, so I'm going to get right into it. This is episode 35 of the Esports Narrative. Just to start, I'm just curious, what's your narrative, right? So what's your background? How did you get into video games when you were a kid? Tell us, the young Tyler, playing video games. What was your first interest in it? And, kind of tell us a short story about where you came from and why you are here right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my favorite things about my job, because I think I sort of ended up going through not expecting to end up where I am. Certainly would not have thought this if you were telling me what I was doing in college. But I started playing video games probably as soon as I could hold a controller. So probably 3 or 4 years old.
Nice.
And for me, it was because my older brother and sister are way older than I am. So they're 10 and 8 years older than me. So we didn't have a lot of shared interests, I guess you could say. But video games around the time of Super Mario and things like that were kind of universally interesting. And that was sort of my first experience with them. And then throughout the years is when I was a kid, I kind of went backwards and played Pong and went forwards with Super Nintendo and N64, PlayStation, kind of like the traditional console start. And as I kind of grew older and was playing more with different types of people, I realized that it wasn't so much about the game so much as the experience around it. So it was a lot more meaningful for me to be able to go over to my friend's house and hang out with people that I liked over something that was really cool, as much as I enjoyed playing games by myself. So I kind of did that and still do that pretty much all the time. After this, I'm probably going to go play PUBG with some of my friends that, happen to work in esports now, but I would have been doing that regardless. When I got to the age of 10, I started running Counter-Strike teams. So that would have been around 2000, 2001. So back when it was CS 1.6, and we were competing in Cal and a bunch of other ones like TWL and other tournament platforms that no longer exist. That was the same time ESEA and CEVO, and those are kind of my fondest memories of esports from way long ago. So I used to run teams, compete in I guess the equivalent of tier 2 tournaments now, Cal I and Cal P and kind of the whole gambit of fun stuff. And then after a while, I realized I was not anywhere near as good as the people that I was playing with. So I learned that I was super good at managing. So I got into event organization and tournament running and stuff that I definitely would not have ever suggested or thought of going anywhere. But I did that all through high school. And then when I got into college, I made my parents the promise that I would stop playing video games. Just because they were like, you're going to go be a physics major, you're going to go to RIT, you're going to be super awesome and, go out into the world, and probably time to stop playing video games. And that was around the time Twitch came out. So it actually was really difficult to keep that promise. And that ended up drawing me back into StarCraft 2 and spent a lot of time on that. And that's when Minecraft came in. So I was never able to really separate myself from gaming. I started my first company when I was a sophomore in college. I used to make custom longboards for people and sell them like all over the world, usually for like downhill racing and things like that. And I think the biggest lesson I took away from that was manufacturing is not the industry that I want to be a part of.
Uh-huh.
uh, it was fun. I learned a lot, and it definitely was probably the first thing that sort of hit me with that entrepreneurial like drive and bug and things to just like go out and start new stuff. Um, but I did that all through college, and then in 2013, I started running tournaments out of my dorm room, and that's what eventually became EGF. So I guess kind of the whole progression was I've always loved video games. I've always loved what video games could drive and represent and sort of do for the people that were playing them. And then just after a while, this sort of organically grew out of things that I was doing anyways. So I guess I'm kind of one of those lucky people that gets to legitimately love what they do. And I don't know. There's a ton of different paths that could have taken me here, and I definitely wouldn't have expected any of them to end this way.
So I'm really curious. Did you always want to work for yourself? Did you always want to be, a number one in kind of doing your own thing as opposed to working for someone else? Or you could, like you said, you had a lot of options. Obviously, you could have done a lot of different things. You could have worked for some organizations and things like that. What was it that was driving you towards wanting to do things kind of on your own, or kind of go out and set the course for yourself as living your life on your terms of what you want to do and being kind of the leader?
I think there's probably, I'm sure that my mother would tell you that she knew it the whole time, but I am a horribly introverted person. And so I think for a long time, I would not have placed myself as someone who is going to go out and start things. I really like to be involved in building things and making things work, but generally not as the at the forefront of it, if you will. So, like when I went to college, I went for physics originally, and then switched into international business and finance. And the plan for me, as I was doing that, was originally that I was either going to go work on Wall Street as an analyst and kind of follow that like path and do the New York thing, go be a consultant, or just take any job that I could get, because I think especially at that point in my life, I had no idea what networking meant or how to do anything that I hope that I'm a little bit better at now.
Mm-hmm.
And so throughout that, I was sort of just kind of going down that path of that expectation. And then when I started in Rage Panda, which was my longboarding company, we did that just because we really hated what was available to us. And I started skating when I was a freshman in college, just because I randomly found a bunch of people on campus that were skating. And one of the kids was a mechanical engineer, and he's like, "Hey, I know how to do this." And me being a recently transferred business major was like, "I'm pretty sure that I know how to sell these." And it just sort of went from there. And then I think once I started to get involved in like the startup uh, spirit, I guess if you will, it becomes super addicting. And so from there, this sort of generated idea of like I want to go out and build things and just be a part of something. Because at the time I was working like 4 jobs maybe. I did everything from food service to my first real job technically was as a defense contractor. And at that point, my job was to essentially help them like develop new markets and product lines and things. So I kind of got involved in small scale companies, large scale companies, like really tedious, like on the line type jobs at McDonald's and the campus cafeteria and stuff. So I guess for me, it was sort of like there's something that I really love to do. I think I know what I'm doing, and I sort of built the elements of what that eventually would become. And so I don't know if there was any one particular moment that kind of made that change so much as a progression of just saying, I know that this is something that I really love. And eventually you just kind of figure out how to make it work.
Yeah, hearing you say that, it definitely sounds super authentic for you to say that. And I feel like you've gotten a lot of experience rather quickly, and you've experienced a lot of different things, which probably has helped you, so far.
I hope so. I would say that I have definitely gone through what I think everybody in on the entrepreneurial world goes through, where there's a lot of times where you have literally no idea what you're doing.
Hmm.
but you try to figure it out as you go, and you just kind of hope that whatever you're doing makes the most sense at the time,
Yeah.
and you kind of learn and progress. And think probably the most important lesson that I was taught early on was, if you screw up, admit that you screwed up, and then figure out how to fix it as quickly as you can, and never hide stuff, and don't be a dick. Like, I
Hmm.
think there was always sort of this like underlying thing is, I think a lot of my impressions for like consulting in Wall Street, which is, again, like what I thought that I might want to do, was like, the movie Boiler Room, or more recently Wolf on Wall Street and things like that. And it was always like, cut everybody down, get as far as you can, as fast as you can.
Right.
And I found that the opposite was way more true.
Yeah. There's somebody that I follow on the internet, Gary V, who's businessman, kind of like really inspirational guy, and he always talks about building the biggest building in town by building the biggest building, not tearing all the other buildings down, which is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially in esports, like people are going to learn your name one way or the other. And I've never heard someone get particularly far by being the antithesis of what our community is supposed to be. So it's way more fun to be collaborative and do things together, especially because I think our industry, even for as large as it's gotten, is still relatively volatile and still very, very small, in terms of like the people that work inside of it. So being friends is really important, especially because when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, everybody just loves what this community has been. They love the idea of playing video games as part of your job and all these types of things, and so there's that underlying commonality. Well, the same threat of like being ostracized or something because you're an ass is pretty real.
Yeah. And this industry honestly is very adolescent and very immature still, like from the people that are involved in it to the organizations, not paying players and tournaments not paying out. Like this industry, from my new perspective, I'll say is very adolescent, very immature to some extent. And it's going to
Yeah,
take a while.
absolutely. I'm glad that it's quickly moving in a better direction, because I think, if you were to look at the industry as a snapshot, I think all the way back to like the early 2000s, no one really even knew what was going on, and everything was sort of very new, and everybody was kind of doing everything. Then you fast forward to 2007, and like you had CGS, which was too early, and had some of its own issues and such. And then you fast forward again to, I don't know, like maybe 2011 to 2013, sort of in like the uprising of League of Legends and things like that. All that was super common, right? You certainly had a lot of problems, and a lot of people were, uh, still pretty much kids, just sort of building an industry that was growing really quickly.
Hmm.
And even 2 years ago, or even a year ago, I think that you'd find all sorts of stories about that. But I think, and I hope that this, is a continuing trend, is that you see as like, more professionalization comes in from organizing bodies, from the developers, from teams that are now invested in by professional sports. Um, those headlines subside pretty quickly and are replaced by these, good stories.
Hmm.
Where you start to see like, hey, it's really awesome that this has happened, and you get to focus on more of those storylines of the players that, may have been eclipsed by some of the negativity that, or negative aspects of what has happened. And I think those have always kind of been more fringe than common, but they certainly got the most attention.
Yeah, negativity is always louder, just like modern media, It's
Yeah.
always the things that are going wrong or that's bad or that's going to kill us or that something is happening that is the loudest.
Yeah. I am certainly looking forward to at least whatever way that I can contribute, kind of adding to those stories of, hey, look at how awesome this is, and what this industry does for people, what it does for communities, uh,
100%.
how awesome it really can be. And then finally, hopefully, eventually turning that corner of, convincing parents and such that, video games are not as evil as they think they are.
Yeah, and so you won the RIT Spring Business Plan competition. That
Yeah.
gave you your initial seed money to launch EGF. You
Hmm.
got top 5 in the RIT Tiger Tank. You were one of 6 teams accepted to the 2014 Saunders Summer Startup program. What makes EGF unique, and how do you compare to other organizations that are trying to accomplish the same thing, like the NACE?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it kind of comes from the progression of what we became as a company and where we got to. Because I think back when we were still students, a lot of what got us to the point that we were able to start funding ourselves and getting accepted into accelerators and eventually going through StartFast and TechStars and now Grand Central Tech are all part of these big, cool development communities. Was that we were just really, really different. Like, uh, you definitely coming from like upstate New York, no one really talked about things that weren't manufacturing or clean energy or healthcare or things like that. So I think a lot of people gave us a lot of leeway to sort of understand and grow. Funnily enough, one of the New York State Business Plan competitions that I went through, I competed against Marty from Splice back when he was still doing Follow Esports. And so, like, we were literally the only two people that probably ever would have told anybody about esports at the time.
That's
So,
funny because I was going to ask you if you had any ties. I'm assuming you did because of the area, but I was going to ask you if you had any ties to Marty, and if that what kind of importance that means to you.
yeah, well, I before I go into the rest of the story, I mean, Marty has always been one of those people that's kind of uniquely amazing in how he drives things, and how he is able to sort of entrance people that may have no idea what esports are into the to the point where they're like the biggest fans. And I think I was really lucky in the business plan competition that we did because he went just before me. And when he came out, he's like, "Yeah, those people have no idea what esports are." But I
He
think I
warmed
got
them
them
up for
through.
you.
Exactly. And so when we went in and we were talking about, what we were planning to do at the time, they were like, "Well, this other guy was like saying these things," and like I don't remember how I responded to that. I'd like to say that I was super friendly and cordial, but I probably was trying to win, so I was probably speaking a little competitively at the time. But yeah, that sort of thing was sort of how we got started as friends. And now, like, we every time that we have an opportunity to hook up, whether it's at a convention or whenever I go back home to either Buffalo or Rochester, we work on a lot of projects together, especially in the space that we work in now. And just following him on Twitter is usually pretty fun because he gets to talk about esports dad life,
Hmm.
uh, and somewhere that I hope to be eventually. Um, but to go back to your original question, I think the way that we progressed was, as I mentioned, we were literally just running tournaments out of my dorm room because I was in res life at the time. And as a requirement for that, you had to do programming for your floor. And RIT, if you're not familiar with it, is probably one of the nerdiest schools on the East Coast,
Hmm.
like behind MIT and some others. But everybody there games, or at least knows about it, and it's very of that culture. So the traditional floor activities that like my boss would suggest just didn't work. So instead, we would run like Quake Lands and Unreal Tournament and things like that. And when Minecraft came out, I remember like we locked ourselves in a dorm for like 12 hours straight and didn't see the light of the day. So there was just sort of this like really exciting culture around gaming to begin with. And so when I was running tournaments, it was originally just for people at RIT, and then it expanded to other colleges. And eventually, after I don't know, probably a couple of months of trying to figure out what we were supposed to call ourselves, we came up with EGF, and we started to progress down this path of just running as many tournaments and as many matches as we possibly could for basically anybody that would give us a chance. And I'm happy to say that a lot of the colleges that started with us way back then are still working with us now in some
Awesome.
capacity. So it's really good to have that like small community feel, even though what we do is at a much larger scale now. So we kind of went from that, um, and I think that if you had seen any of our pitches from back then, you probably would, if you were any familiar with esports, you'd probably think that we were crazy and that we didn't know what we were talking about because we probably didn't. Um, but we sort of progressed, and the what ultimately came of it was this mission that we always sort of had in the back of our mind of what we now refer to as being like the next generation of the NCAA. So we don't think about it as something that replaces sports or even necessarily falls under the same category, but really looks at what sports has set in terms of precedent, and then sort of evolve beyond that. And especially when you look at a lot of the challenges that or criticisms of the NCAA and issues that I would say that if you talk to anybody in college athletics or college administration or college students, they all want to fix, but they've never had a way to really go about that. So now we get way more involved in things that I definitely would not have trusted like 22-year-old me to be a part of. So we kind of, like I said, we went from running tournaments to getting involved with program development in colleges. So we had started advising like small schools about what esports were, kind of how they worked in the real world, ways that they could build programs eventually, and some of them actually went on to do so. And then we sort of evolved into what we do today. So today, our company is focused on basically three operations. One is the league, so the governing body handling logistics, like all the stuff that goes into making a league work at a really highly professionalized world. So we work primarily with Division I schools in terms of traditional athletics, and put a lot of time and effort into figuring out how esports can be the best version of what a college and a student wants. The second category is kind of going back to our roots with program development, help working with colleges and now high schools and countries and things like that on the development of esports programs and ecosystems. So that can be literally going in and running workshops to just tell an administration what esports are, because certainly a lot of them are of a generation that didn't grow up with video games, and so their familiarity with it is limited. So we'll go in and kind of walk them through what the ecosystem is, tell them what happens in the pro scenes, that people make money off of it. Sometimes take them to events like Worlds or an ESL event or something like that to really show them what that means, and then walk through every aspect of a program development, which could be something like showing them how to build out an arena, teaching them what like a cyber cafe is, all the way up to hiring coaches, teaching them how to do tryouts, kind of all the stuff that is really common in traditional athletics, but trying to show that transition from one to the other can still be kind of a challenge for some people that just don't think of video games that way. And then the third component of what we do is all about broadcast and education. So we do live event production, we broadcast all of our tournaments, and we also started working with colleges and with high schools on esports curriculum development. So how you use esports not only as a platform for competition, but also for engagement and education for people that are pursuing a career in esports outside of the aspiration of going pro.
So you mentioned a lot of different operations there that are very diverse in runs the gamut of what you do.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is that how you sustain yourself as far as revenue is concerned? Like you get reimbursed by the colleges or the organizations that you're assisting? Is that where the money comes from, or how do you sustain it and how do you grow from where you are now?
Yeah, it's kind of a mixture of all of those things. It kind of depends on the capacity in which we work with a university or a group. We have gotten to the point now where we've split into, I shouldn't say split, we've figured out how every operation that we do fits into one package and can be applied to a bunch of just different scenarios. And that's how our business is essentially built. So we run a college league that is split between what you would refer to as a varsity program or a formalized program league, and then one specifically for clubs that are in the process of developing into a formalized program. And then we also run a high school league. And so through all that, we end up with government contracts, relationships with schools and things like that that ultimately support our business. And the idea is that eventually you get to a point where you can go through the sponsorship and advertising and all that sort of stuff that kind of is what the majority of esports kind of depends on at this point in time.
That's awesome. So
Yeah.
last year, and hopefully my numbers are correct, but let's say last year, 40 colleges established varsity esports programs. I'm curious on if you know an updated number on what that is, like a total amount of college varsity esports programs, and how many do you think there'll be in the next year that spring up esports programs?
Yeah, I think we're up to 45 45 or 47, depending on who you ask. And those vary in formalization, I suppose you could say. Like all of them offer some level of scholarship, but for some of them that means like a semesterly stipend of a small amount of money. Others are like full rides, kind of similar to what you'd see in traditional athletics. I think, and hopefully we're a big driver of this. I hope to see that number at least increase by 50%. So getting up to like the 60, 70, 80 college range. I have no idea if that's feasible because I think colleges are just starting to turn on that machine, if you will, and start to make that
Mhm.
transition. And it can take a college a really long time to make that choice. So I think just because some schools, especially at the like most of the schools that are make up that group are smaller Division three schools or they're NAIA schools in terms of traditional athletics, and so they have some ability to move faster than some of like the gigantic universities that you would eventually hope to see enter the space. And so I think if you'll see a lot more smaller schools start to do the same thing. And then depending on what happens on the larger side, it may happen this year or not.
So how many schools do you guys have under your EGF brand?
Um, in some capacity, we work with about 75 or more schools.
Awesome.
All kind of depends on the capacity that we can add the most value. And all of them sort of take advantage of the different aspects of what we offer depending on what their specific situation is.
Yeah.
And then about, I guess it'd be 3 weeks ago. No, sorry, exactly 1 month ago today, we announced our partnership with the state of Connecticut to do high school stuff.
hmm
So we work with state associations, districts, city governments, and stuff like that, essentially doing the same thing we do for colleges to help develop programs, compete in a national league, and then we do a bunch of really cool stuff kind of across the country.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was going to ask you about that, so I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's important to develop at those levels as well, right?
Yeah, we kind of look at our world as less about like a separation between high school and college, at least in terms of our operations perspective, and more about how we can develop communities. So if we took an example like Connecticut, UConn has competed in tournaments with us basically since we started our latest round of tournaments last year in 2016. And we got involved with some local groups that were doing sort of like this high school organization thing just to uh, essentially as an after school activity for students. So they were putting their time into something productive. And that sort of progressed into a partnership with a couple of the schools to help them, get into college, into some of the esports programs that exist, and then eventually turned into our partnership with the state. And we'll be doing the same thing in a bunch of other states and cities and stuff this year. So our goal, whenever we end up in one of those situations, is you look at an area like Connecticut, and the state's relatively small, so every high school getting involved is something like 511 high schools, I think, and
Which is
then there are a
still a
couple
lot.
colleges. Yeah, but it's kind of like it's a relatively small state, so like it's not too much to travel all over the place, and you
Right,
can do
right.
a bunch of really cool stuff with local colleges. So we run our two leagues in parallel with one another, and then so you'll have your weekly matches or your tournaments that are set up specifically for one or the other. And then we run these community events that are designed to integrate both communities. So if you're at UConn, one of the things we did in our pilot season in the spring of 2017 was to run our state championships at UConn. And so we were working with the club there. We got administration involved, and it was like this really cool way to have the state really get behind the college to kind of give back to their community. And what they ended up doing was giving scholarships to the state champions to their school of engineering. So when we started to see really cool things like that happen, we saw a lot of possibilities to not just kind of share the passion for gaming between those two demographics, but also just demographics of gaming. Because when we do these community events, we get to expand into other games that we can't run during a regular season for technical reasons. Like running League of Legends and Overwatch, you can do it online, you can do it on a LAN setting, whatever. It's pretty easy to kind of move between the two. But games like FIFA and NBA 2K and Smash and things like that, you can do it that way, but it's not the same. So we try to celebrate the entire idea of development because then you have all these really cool things start to happen. You see start to people really start to understand the network outside of their particular school, for instance. And our hope is that sort of creates these much stronger fabrics and communities and networks and opportunities for people to engage with the community and kind of find the opportunities to go off to college, go pro, or some other way. We end up hiring a lot of the people that go through our system. So certainly a good way to get a job.
So how big is EGF? Like how many full-time staff? Do you have a lot of volunteers? Like what's the makeup?
I would say out of our total staff, about 70% of them are seasonal. So people that help us with like broadcast and event production and things that we do. Like we're going to be running our New York City tournament at the Microsoft flagship store, and so we'll bring in a bunch of casters and people that do stuff in New York City for us. And then our full-time staff is kind of focused on directing and progression and sales and all the normal business stuff. So I think in total, we're at somewhere between 50 and 60 people.
Awesome.
And everybody sort of gets involved in all sorts of different things.
Awesome.
Everybody wears a lot of hats.
Yeah, as it really as it should in a startup, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I want to ask a kind of a controversial question when it comes to, you know, athletes in sports, collegiate athletes in particular, in making money. Should collegiate esports athletes be allowed to make money?
I believe 100%. I think, like I said earlier, one of the things that we always try to do is study the hell out of traditional sports, because like most of the people on our staff, when they were going through high school and college and whatever, were also part of the athletic system. So like in high school, for instance, I would go to the weight room, I would go to school, I would go to wrestling practice, and then I would come home and run my Counter-Strike team. And that's a similar experience for a lot of the people on staff. So when we sort of sat down and came up with that mission of like what does the next generation of the NCAA look like, we had to first understand everything that went into what the NCAA actually was, why the governing systems existed, how they did, what worked really well, where were the opportunities for improvement, and what did people just absolutely hate. And you'll find a kind of across the board, there's a lot of things that are very common, whether you're talking to an administrator, a student, even people within governing bodies themselves that think, you know, if I could do this over again, here are all these things that we would change. So for us, we tried to take whatever inspiration we could from traditional sports that worked really well. Things as basic as like having a regular season with championships, right? But then getting into more prickly issues or controversial issues, as you said, like player compensation. Certainly, if you were to compare traditional sports and esports right now, most people that go and compete in an esports tournament, even if you're competing in like a ULAL or a TESPA, you're competing for some sort of prize money, whether it's in the form of scholarships or straight cash or whatever. It's still some monetary value. In traditional athletics, you know, you're not even allowed to stream on YouTube or Twitch just because if you're using your likeness, then it goes against NCAA rules, and people have a lot of mixed feelings about that. For us, we kind of look at the system of if we're working with administrators, it's not going to happen immediately. There's going to be a progression, and certainly trying to convince people that, you know, video games are something that they should support and esports programs are something they should build is sort of step one. And then starting to look at not just player compensation, but player representation, community engagement, education, a bunch of aspects that sort of build around the esports core, all come in time. So for us, every university that we work with, we put them down this path of our core belief as an organization and as EGF, is that there's been so many paths laid out by groups like the Knight Commission, for instance, that provide a really feasible path for someone to make money and still be a student. And I think that that's really important to what we do. So we definitely are moving in that direction. The hardest part is kind of figuring out how you do that in a way that's responsible, and then sort of at the same time shifting a culture that's very set in a way that's been developed over like, you know, the last 110 years.
Do you
So we'll get there.
Yeah, and I'm really curious about this because as you're saying that, and as I was listening to it, I thought, I wonder, is esports going to be what is esports going to be the thing that completely disrupts the NCAA and forces them to change or adapt? Because if these, let's say you're a Division One football player, right,
Mhm.
and you're going to go to Ohio State or something like that.
Right.
Let's say, you could go to Ohio State where they have sponsorship deals by, I don't know, I'm just throwing these, I don't know for sure, but Nike or Under Armour or whatever, big name brands are sponsoring the college. The college gets money. Everyone gets money except the players to some extent. Are you going to, as that D1 football player, are you going to take that scholarship for like a full ride and go that route? Or are you thinking, maybe I want to, make money while I'm going to college, and maybe I want to try and get good at Overwatch or League of Legends or something like that? And if esports is a body that's allowing college students to earn money and stream and use their personal brand to make a living, do you think that that's going to disrupt or force the NCAA to change and adapt and figure out a way where student athletes can earn money while they go to college?
I think regardless of whether or not esports was involved in the college athletics discussion, that it eventually would change. Because I think the amount of money that's paid for like March Madness rights and all that sort of stuff has just been going up and up and up and up. And I think, with the interconnectivity of students now, it's certainly a lot easier to put together a movement and call for change. And I think that if you have a conversation with student athletes and athletic directors and university presidents and all that sort of stuff, like it's something that they think about a lot more frequently than you might think. And so I think on their own, regardless of whether or not we're involved, it's going to move in that direction. And I think when we think of our space in the world, like I see a world where there's EGF and there's the NCAA that handles traditional athletics. We handle esports, and we live peacefully together. And I think the overlap may be there. I mean, like we certainly see at the high school level, students that will play football in the fall and then they'll play League of Legends in the spring. So I think there's going to be some level of convergence where the two cultures sort of come together in some capacity. And I think for us, we we watch what happens really closely, because certainly when you're operating at that level with those types of people, like there's no way that things don't interact with one another to some degree at least. But ultimately, we kind of stay focused on what we're doing and just sort of see what happens on the other side. And again, try to learn any lessons that we can. Even just looking back through history, and trying to understand what decisions were made and why. I mean, like if you go back through the history of the NCAA, like they at one point players did get paid. They had what's called like a laundry money fund where they would get a stipend, so kids could actually not starve to death
Mm-hmm.
while they were playing sports. So I think for a lot of it, it's sports are moving in their own direction, and they have enough things to worry about to kind of figure that out on our own.
Uh,
For us, we kind of focus on the biggest challenges, which is oftentimes convincing people that of the value of esports and ultimately what it can do for their communities.
so how do you not become the NCAA? Like you mentioned that you want to become a better version of the NCAA for esports. So how do we not get down that path of what the NCAA has become to known today? How do we do better?
Well, I think a lot of it kind of starts with core values of what we do and how we represent ourselves. So some of the conversations that we have very early on with everyone is like EGF is a for-profit company, and that lets us do a lot of interesting things about how we operate, what we're allowed to do, and ultimately keep up that level of transparency. And I think that that's a really important component because although being a nonprofit may be in our future, at least to some degree or some form, it really sets the tone for us not hiding who we are and not becoming that black box and making sure that everybody's responsible for or accountable rather for anything that's going on. and then kind of going through this process of saying, we believe in the idea of paying players. We believe in this level of transparency and doing all these things. And as we bring on more and more universities, making sure that they understand and buy into that same mission. Even going down into the high school side of it, of working with a state association, an individual teacher, or whatever. It's really like instilling that belief that what you're doing is important, and that it's really truly meant to add a significant benefit to their students. So in a way, it's sort of that um, philosophical endeavor and movement and convincing and everything that goes into that. Um, and then in practical sense, it's um, really looking at the blueprints that have set before us, working with universities, administrators, making sure students are always involved, and looking at this ecosystem and saying, all right, well, if an organization before us went down this path and they ended up running into X, Y, and Z issue, how do we take that same path but avoid those mistakes? And ultimately, I'm sure there's going to be a time where we're just so massive or so complex that there's going to be a lot of problems. But kind of staying true to that mission to the best of our ability is, I think, what's going to be the most important component. I mean, we look at FIFA a lot, and certainly they have been around forever and went through a lot of interesting turmoil in terms of corruption and things like that. So a part of it's just learning from history, making sure that everybody understands exactly who you are and what you're doing, and why you're doing it, and then just trying to live that as much as you can. So certainly, as long as I'm at the head of the company, that's going to be the case, and I certainly hope that anybody that takes over me as my predecessor, whether it's now or 100 years later, has the same will and drive, and really holds true to that. And I think the the world really wants change, and certainly wants to believe in something that can have that level of um, I hate using the word authenticity, but essentially that. And so I honestly don't know the entire answer to the question, but that's what we're doing and what we're trying to accomplish. And I certainly hope that that gets us to the point where we can really understand how to make sure every practical step we take keeps us in that path.
I believe you 100%. And, I do like the word authenticity because it's, it's not said enough. And when you meet someone who has that raw, authentic, honest, perspective, it's nice to have it. And I believe what you're saying. And I, am inspired by what you've shared. And I see the value in what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish. And for someone who's also passionate about esports, I think it's really amazing to have these people who are warriors essentially for dealing with the negative criticism and the pushback. And I'm curious if obviously you're probably getting some pushback, right? Are you getting pushback, and how do you explain to someone, like you mentioned earlier, the value of esports to the community?
I think a lot of it is hearing every possible barrier put up to why someone should even take esports seriously. Because going back to when we were running tournaments and when we were going through like the even like way back to the Tiger Tank days, um, we probably got every possible question you could imagine, including ones that made absolutely no sense. And part of that process was also going and talking with administrators, from athletic directors to student life presidents and SG presidents and university presidents and things like that. Like back in 2013, and just asking them, what do you think about esports, or do you know what this is? And at that point, I'd say there's probably like 80% of them or more either had no idea what it was and had no interest in it, or were pretty hostile to the idea. But now that esports has essentially built its own case studies, right? You see sold out stadiums like Madison Square Garden and the Staples Center and the Seoul Soccer Stadium and Mercedes-Benz Arena, and all those different places that you can look at pictures of, you can see videos of, you can actually go and experience that. That attitude has changed pretty significantly, and I think you see that certainly with the investment from professional sports and professional teams, the number of colleges that offer scholarships now, the fact that entire state was willing to put their faith in us, that they could trust us in terms of the development of their students. um, those conversations have become significantly more positive. And so I'd still say that, 60 to 70% of my job is just talking about how amazing esports are, how it impacted my own life, and showing how it impacts the lives of so many. And then, showing them that like here's how you can make a career out of this. Here's how it can be used as an educational tool. Here's a way to engage with a group of students that may not care about football, or they grew up playing Minecraft or watching YouTube videos, and so they're more interested in doing that than going outside and playing baseball. And when you combine all these points together, you make a really compelling case for um, maybe not sup- I shouldn't say not supporting the idea, but not necessarily believing it, but not getting in its way or not actively trying to inhibit it. Um, that is definitely a lot different from when we started, because I remember when we did the Tiger Tank competition, we were against, like, I don't know, 5 other companies in the finals or something like that, and it was like a Snapchat clone, and like some other ones that were kind of cool. And I think the one that won was like a somebody that made boat hulls out of fiberglass or something that was kind of cool. I don't know. But when we get up and give our presentation, they give you basically 5 minutes to explain it, and the entire industry of esports, and then what we do, which is relatively complex when you think about everything that I talked about. And then you ask questions, and they ask standardized questions of how big can this be, and what proof do you have around like student engagement numbers and stuff on campus. And then one guy had got up and said, "You know what? I think I understand and believe what you do, but what I'd really like to know is how you answer for the fact that the video games are hurting my Second Amendment rights." And so, like, that was something that I definitely would never have expected to have to answer, like, when I was essentially a 20-year-old kid trying to figure out how to explain what I had in my head. But that was sort of like one extreme of a question that really wasn't tied into what we did. It really didn't have anything to do with it, but in somebody's mind, it was a really
Interesting.
uh, negative side, right? So I think a lot of that conversation has changed, and now we're kind of prepared for all of that. So when people ask us questions about any element of it, we can say, well, I understand why you think that, or the impression that you got of it, but let me show you what this means. And you can pull up a YouTube video or something, and it becomes very real.
Do you remember what
Like
you said?
uh, I I don't. I think if I remember correctly, it was we got into like some studies about violence in video games and things like that, because I honestly didn't understand exactly what he was saying. But like, it was also a more conservative individual, and so kind of walking through what that was an interesting conversation to have. We ended up talking afterwards for a while about what that was, and he's like, you know what, I 100% believe that you're exactly what you're going to do. I just, in my mind, like, this is what I blame for what I see happening, and therefore I can't support it. So it was sort of a difference of opinion that we just kind of came to that conclusion of, we're probably never going to get to a point where we agree on this. But it was a productive and civil conversation. So we haven't been asked that since. But and I honestly don't really know what I would say if I was asked that today, but it would probably be something along the lines of, I think there are other things that might be impacting that a little bit more than
Yeah.
the things that we can do.
I
But it's been kind of a long-standing progression, and certainly it's really cool to have people from even when I was a little kid, that like go to my mother's church or something, asking, what is this, and can you explain it to me? And people well into like their 70s and 80s kind of understanding it. Even my own parents, like, it wasn't, having played Counter Strike and stuff since I was a little kid. It wasn't really until E League ended up on TBS, and I was watching it when I was home for I don't remember if it was like Thanksgiving or Christmas or something like that at my parents' house, and I was sitting on the couch watching it. And my parents came home, and I like sat them down and explained what was going on. And suddenly, like, the last 15 years of what I had done with my life, like, all made sense to them. So
mhm.
there's all these cool elements to now make a very compelling case for even the most hardcore opponents, or at least critics of what esports is, to show that's totally fine that you feel that way, but here's all these amazing things that can come out of it. And this is why the work that we do is really important to us, because we're able to provide scholarships to students, we're able to engage them with the community, we're able to help them, find other people that they're really passionate about. And one of the things that I love talking about more than anything is how we try to impact the mental health challenges that tend to be a little bit more pronounced in our community.
For sure.
So there's all these really amazing things that just drown out any naysayers, if you will. That being said, like, we certainly take criticism as seriously as anything, because while we certainly go out with a really strong mission, we're far from perfect, and we've made a lot of mistakes, and we've certainly probably said a lot of dumb things. But it's nice to have that check to say, if we set out to do this and we're not accomplishing that goal, what went wrong and how can we fix that? And I think that even goes back to your point of how do you avoid going down the path that other organizational bodies have, and trying to make sure that what we do stays true to what it is, not just now, but 5 and 10 and 15 and 100 years from now.
So what else does the esports industry need to continue to grow and be successful?
I think it just needs to keep making progress in the direction that it's been going. I mean, things like players unions, I think, are really important. I think um, I would say a healthy balance for the developer's influence is also somewhat important. Making sure that players have proper representation, that teams are not falling into the same headlines that you had mentioned before of making sure that everybody's getting paid on time, that people are having a positive experience with it. And I think the next big challenge after I think that's all going to be something that progresses over a long period of time, right? Like things like governance and leagues and players associations and all sorts of things that uh, are common in traditional sports and certainly have a specific purpose there, will take time to develop. And so while that's going on, I think some of the other things that need to happen are just broader non-endemic fan engagement. So finding people like my parents and giving them the opportunity to look at esports and understand it, maybe not what's happening in the game, but at least understand the experience. And I think that that's something that's starting to happen the more exposure you see, like even putting like Smash, and I think it was Marvel versus Capcom on Disney XD, things like that, where certainly that would never have happened even probably 4 or 5 years ago. Those are giving new touch points and kind of helping build the momentum that keeps this at a position where even if a game fails, like if people stop playing League of Legends or Overwatch or something that are arguably the leaders in the space right now, that it's okay because enough people understand the concept of an esport that whatever the next game is can find a proper fan base. So I think a lot of it's sort of that foundational aspect to the pro level, making sure that we're speaking to an audience that may have no idea that we even exist yet. And then from our perspective, we look at how the foundational aspects of uh, students kind of go through this process and what their career path looks like. And a lot of the programs that we got involved with actually stemmed from just shortages that we had. Like we started a caster education program that we call the EGF Caster Corps, just because when we were like running tournaments back in 2013 and 2014 and on from there, we literally just couldn't find enough people that were high enough quality to do broadcast for us. So we went out and found procasters and other people that had worked with us for a long time and just started trying to recruit more people, get them involved in things, and actually are now working on legitimate training. So I think there's a bunch of elements that sort of fall into those different buckets of foundational core components that are in the works and are developing, ways to continue the overall expansion and exposure to esports, and then just sort of that sustainable future of where do you find careers and how do you interact with what's going to be your next generation of fans.
So I had one more question I want to ask you, and that was you mentioned it briefly of getting the older generations involved, the 40-year-olds or 35 plus. How do you bridge the gap between the young kids, the 18 to 20-year-olds who are playing professionally or playing in collegiate environment? How do you bridge the gap between them and their parents? How do you get the older audiences more involved? And is that even something that we should focus on?
Absolutely. I think um, before you look at how you can bring in a large group of people, you have to, I think, come to a level of acceptance that there are a group of people that are just never going to accept this. Like for them, it's
Hmm.
either um, of it's either outright offensive in some capacity to them, or they're just at a point in their life where they just literally don't care, or just like I'm not a huge soccer fan. I like will still go to games, but I'm not going to actively engage in that community. Um, Generally speaking. So when you've set those types of people aside, and you kind of look at everybody else, people that might casually get involved in it, or people that could become, I guess what some might describe as like a super fan. A lot of them are discovering it through their kids. So if you think about, a lot of those people that either have kids or grandkids, depending on what age they're at, when they're watching them interact with things, like I said, they're on videos or they're playing video games, and sometimes it's part of their educational curriculum. Sometimes they're the people that are going to tell you all about Cloud9 and TSM and teams that they really love. And parents start to take interest in that as a way to connect with their kids. Sometimes it's something that's just so out there and crazy to them that it's just super interesting for them to learn about. And some of them end up becoming the biggest advocates for it. And I think when we interact with parents, especially at the high school level, it does take some time for some of them to come to the acceptance that what they normally would have seen as a hobby or like a free time activity for their kid is now on par with them participating in a football team or uh, some other competitive after school activity that starts out being really foreign, but then once they have the opportunity to be exposed to that, again, going to an event or watching a Twitch stream or something like that really starts to illustrate how impactful it is for those kids. And then whatever direction they take it to, like maybe they don't care about League of Legends, but it doesn't really matter to them because ultimately the most important thing is that kid. For other people, sometimes it's just creating those incidental opportunities where like when ESL comes to New York, or when I am able to go to like a Boston or an LA or whatever, I'll try to bring as many of my friends as I can that have never been to an event before, just so they understand. First of all, so when I talk about what I do for a living, they can kind of relate to it and understand, and don't
Hmm.
look like an alien from outer space.
Sure.
But it definitely makes a really big impact on them. So I think there's a lot of things that do it. I think a lot of it comes through just our kids, grandkids, or whatever getting like super into it, and then kind of understanding whether or not there are people that are going to convert or kind of be distant or hostile. And I think, especially in the last year or 2 years, you've seen that group of the older generation becoming fans or at least interested has, um, at least from my perspective and my interactions, really changed a lot. So I don't know. I certainly know that there's a lot of people in the world that still have no idea what esports are, and our job is to kind of convert as many people as we can, even if it's one at a time.
Yeah, there's so many millions that are watching Twitch, that are watching these competitions, and it's still stunning to see how little esports has really penetrated the global market.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to think like in terms of scale. Certainly, like we watch numbers go up and up and up and up from starting when you couldn't even watch a tournament streamed, or you had to do something like go on GoTV and then sync up the audio from Winamp or something of like Red Eye casting a Counter-Strike match, and like that was your way, and there was no way to interact. And to go from that to the point where you have uh, what is it, right? So like 360 million people watch Worlds last year or something. That is an insane scale. But then you look at the amount of dollars that go into our industry in terms of revenue, even in terms of investment and things like that, and then compare it to something like traditional sports or even the video game industry at large, it's still really small.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of things that there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of people to educate. There's a lot of support and infrastructure that needs to be built out to kind of keep this at the scale that it's currently perceived to be. And I really hope that what we do, what's happening with Overwatch League, with the LCS franchise, kind of everybody that has their part to play in the world is moving in the right direction, continuing to do so, and really putting us in a position where this isn't something that fades out in the next 10 years, but really becomes a really strong staying power.
So I opened up some questions on Facebook, and I was told that you have the best beard in all of esports. So how do you maintain such a stunning beard?
Um, well, it's a lot of hard work and a lot of concentration and a lot of positive thinking before I go to sleep. Uh, no, I don't really know. I actually don't do all that much with it. uh, Learning to comb your beard, I think, is the number one thing. Because there was definitely a time when I was in high school, like all kids going through puberty, that I would not understand the difference between good and bad facial hair if it hit me in the face, or was on my face for that matter. I've certainly looked at pictures from high school and thought, whew.
How long have you been growing that?
This current iteration of my beard has been 4 months, I think. I end up going through like phases of it because occasionally you just don't want it anymore, and so you cut it really short. Or
Mhm.
I wanted to grow what's called a yeared, so like you just grow a beard for a year without any interruptions. And I had tried for that, but then I went to a barber just to get it trimmed so I didn't look like I was putting a bird's nest on my face. And they ended up like shaving like 5 inches of my beard off. So I was a
Nice.
little upset about that. So I started over again. Life's good. I hope it's better than it used to be, at least in some capacity. But I try to imagine my life without it now, and it's very difficult. I think
It's become such a part of you.
it is. I remember when I was in college, it was the first time that I had like a long beard, and I shaved it off one day as part of we did a charity event for Roswell Cancer Research Institute, and it was essentially like we called it a beard bounty. So people would donate, X amount of dollars, and if you hit like a certain mark, then you could vote on what style of facial hair whoever you were voting for had to shave it into. And I ended up with mutton chops, and
Nice.
so like there was a large part of my beard missing for a while. And then after that, I was like, well, you kind of have to shave everything to start over again. And when I did that, I was walking around college at the time, and people that I had known for like several years like walked past me and didn't even recognize me. So I definitely wonder what my life would be like without it, but I'm glad that I don't have to worry about that.
You can go incognito. You just grow a long beard and no one knows who you are.
Yeah, well, if I ever decided to turn to a life of crime, I feel like, you get maybe a week of just like strong crime spree and then shave it off. And
Nice.
Yeah.
Tyler, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It was super awesome talking to you, and I was really inspired by what you said, and I really believe in what you're doing and what you're trying to create and build and do for the esports industry. So I really appreciate your time, and I thank you for coming on and sharing with what you're doing and your passion and your core beliefs and your mission. And I think it's really awesome, and thank you for sharing with us, and I wish you super good luck and success with everything going forward. And we'll definitely be keeping an eye on seeing what you're doing, and fully supporting everything that you guys are doing, because I think it's really awesome to see what you're doing for the industry.
I appreciate that much, and I really appreciate you having me on. It's always fun to get up and talk way too long about things that I hope people care about, but I know that I can ramble. If I may, before I go, I always like to plug my dear
Absolutely, go
friends
for it.
at Anxiety Gaming. They're the group that we partner with on mental health services.
Yeah.
Because they're like my absolute favorite people in the world, and Jason Docton is like,
Yeah, I talked to him.
he's like one of the most beautiful souls I've ever encountered in my life. So if anybody wants to like donate to them or do anything to support that, or if you're one of the people in need of their services, check them out at anxietygaming.com. Like that's even ahead of plugging me. So I love them to death. I think they're amazing. So definitely get behind that.
For sure. I fully support them as well. Like I had Jason on, and he opened up really deeply about his struggle and why he started Anxiety Gaming and what they're doing. And just to reiterate what you said, I mean, absolutely a necessity for people to reach out if those who might not otherwise have an outlet to talk to someone. They're doing great stuff.
Yeah, literally my favorite people on the planet.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tyler. It really means a lot to me that you came on, and I wish you the best of luck, and hope you have a good rest of your night and playing PUBG with your buddies and everything like that. Have super much fun, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey guys, real quick before you go, I just want to say thanks for listening and supporting the show. It really means a lot to me that you like it, and I hope that if you found some value from this podcast, that you'll share it on Twitter or on Instagram or Facebook, anywhere that you have a social media presence. I would love it if you would just share it with 3 to 4 people that might be interested in it. It would absolutely mean the world to me. It would help me get my name out there, help me get the podcast out there. I do this solely for the love of esports and for the love of getting to know people and hearing the stories of esports that I think are so awesome. So please, if you got value from this, if you enjoyed it, please share it with someone who you think might like it. And with that, I will see you next time. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it.